This is the Almost Daily Zencast. Hello, and namaste. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. I am your humble host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. Let's get started.
It's just a few bad apples. Just a few bad apples. No big deal. I have personally heard this analogy, this aphorism, this common sense statement used to excuse and ultimately turn a blind eye to everything from corruption in politics to the nefarious inner workings of organized religion and everything in between. And the way it seems to be commonly used nowadays does not jive with what I personally think the original intent of the statement might have been. People say, oh, it's just a few bad apples. There's no reason to persecute the entire group. Don't let a few bad apples ruin the bunch. But the thing is, people use that phrase to dismiss the call to action. I've said to folks, we need to make a stand against the Catholic Church because it is, by all intents, and what's that phrase? By all measures, there's a phrase I can't remember right there, sorry. By all reasonable measure, the Catholic Church has been operating as a worldwide criminal organization that focuses on profiteering, sowing conflict, and protecting pedophile priests. They get away with this by putting up the front that the good they do is overwhelmingly more important and larger than just the few bad apples that often get caught doing bad things. But you will note the fact remains that to this day, after decades of exposés and investigations into the church and its less than honorable actions, I have heard of 0 priests being held accountable for their nefarious behavior. I've heard devout Catholics who are really devoted to the church say, well, it's just a few bad apples. You can't hold the whole institution accountable for those few bad apples. I'm sorry. What the fuck? No. I'm sorry. I think that we cannot allow that sort of ego trap thinking to pervade our society. We cannot excuse an institution that clearly has a systemic problem by minimizing it to, it's just a few bad apples. The original intention of the phrase, I do believe, was a warning that if you let the few bad apples linger and commingle with the rest of the bunch of apples, they will all rot. A few bad apples will ruin the bunch. Thus, the logical conclusion is that one must do something about those bad apples. But those who use this phrasing today to excuse politics at large, organized religion at large, and everything in between, they seem to use it in such a way that then alleviates the call to action. It's like, there's nothing we can do. Oh, sure, hold those few bad apples accountable. Do the few bad apples ever really get held accountable? For every corrupt politician that gets exposed, how many more continue with the corruption? For every expose in a community that has a problem with pederast priests, How many of those priests get shuffled to other communities and hidden away from the law? Those bad apples must be dealt with. Now, do not jump to conclusions. I'm not out for revenge. I'm not out for mindless violence. I'm not in support of or calling for retaliatory actions that basically belittle us to the level of the bad apples. Does that make sense? What's the best way to cope with a bad apple? Don't let it get into the basket with the rest of the apples. Now, obviously one cannot predict which apple will go bad first. Vigilance is required. Observation of the apples is necessary. And a clear and unclouded vision is necessary to identify the bad apples in time, to separate them from the rest of the group and do something about them. In a world where corruption is systemic, in a world where ego can hijack anything and anyone, in a world where the bad apples tend to have a shiny outer layer that makes them look juicier and even tastier than an ordinary apple, the few bad apples tend to get away with being bad. Now, I'm not about delineating good and bad in the world, right? I'm a huge fan of the relativistic understanding that very little is good or bad, but thinking makes it so. Now, I've just created a paradox. I'm talking about things that are bad, and then I'm also saying there's no such thing as bad. How do we solve that? The catch I'm trying to point out is that we get distracted, right, by the shiny outer surface. Those who are the most corrupt tend to be the most charismatic. Good and evil is not an absolutist, simple, black and white thing. But a rotten apple is a rotten apple. We are human beings, though, right? We're not pieces of fruit. We're not plucked from our tree and put in refrigeration in hopes that we'll survive transportation. We are living, breathing human beings, and those of us that are corrupt are often indistinguishable from those of us that are virtuous. And in between those two extremes, most of us, in all honesty, and this is a hard pill to swallow, most of us are some subtle mix of two things. No one, very few people, let's say, because it's a trap, right? It's a language trap. No one is absolute, but you just made an absolute statement. No one is absolutely good. No one is absolutely evil. Even the worst of us were once human beings born into this world free of corruption. We need to advance and elevate and evolve our understanding and our use of language around these concerns. If we constantly minimize and flatten out the problems we face into the world into two-dimensional, right or wrong, absolutist type equations, we miss out on the nuance and the complexities of what's going on. And when we rely on axioms and misapplied analogies, we really miss the boat. There are bad apples everywhere. Some of them only have a tiny little smudge of rottenness and are 98% pretty good. Do you throw that apple with one little tiny brown spot away? Or do you do something about the little tiny brown spot so that the rest of the apple can be enjoyed? When an apple is completely, thoroughly rotten to the core, well, there's not much left to do, but throw it away. You don't eat it, right? When an apple is somewhere in the middle, you might be able to salvage half. With people, it isn't that simple. It's infinitely more complex. And what ego wants us to do is to minimize and dismiss. When we minimize and dismiss the problems, the corruption, the rottenness, it makes it easy to ignore our involvement as individuals and as participants in communities. It makes it easy to push the problem over there. I'm not the rotten apple, it's that guy. Our group has no rotten apples in it, it's that other bundle over there. Here's the thing. We put apples into bunches and baskets because we're commodifying them and they need to be transported to be sold and consumed. And while we are doing that to ourselves, that is not, I don't think, and I would humbly suggest, that is not what we are supposed to be doing to ourselves. And that the issues that we face regarding corruption, regarding bad actors, evil people, rotten apples, it reaches deeper than just identifying this one individual and blaming them for the problems. We as human beings are only imaginarily divided up into different bunches. The human species is one species. Every human individual is 99.99999999999 ad nauseum. There's like a massive number of nines after that percentage, after that decimal point in this percentage. 99.999, add as many nines as you want, percent identical. We are almost clone duplicates of each other. It's that tiny little 1% that makes us unique and special and different. And that variety, that variance within that very narrow margin of measurable differences is perceived and expressed in ways that are infinitely diverse. If we are all one species, if we are all one community, and we are all one interconnected and intra-related family, dividing ourselves up into bunches and declaring that this bunch is more rotten than the other bunch doesn't achieve much, except pitting us against one another, creating conflict, and distracting us from the solution. I talk a lot about what I think the solution is, and I know it's easy to dismiss. But if we really want to deal with the rottenness, we must pursue that solution that is so easily dismissed and has for so long been marginalized and ridiculed. This makes me think of an interesting thing someone posted on the social medias recently. I came across it a day or two ago. It was in some Facebook group. I believe the Facebook group might have the word Namaste in the title, but that's irrelevant. In terms of like remembering the name of the group, it's not really important. Someone wrote or posted a statement. If the Buddha said to you, you have to forgive Donald Trump in order to achieve enlightenment, would you? There's only one answer to that question. Yes. And it shouldn't have anything to do with whether or not we will be rewarded with enlightenment. Forgiveness is at the core of true transformative healing. I'm trying to think of a way to translate forgiveness into the bad apple analogy. But tragically, because the apples in that analogy are already plucked from their source of life, in other words, they're already dying. No matter what you do, they will all rot away because we've severed them from their source of life and interrupted their natural organic trajectory, which is, of course, to fall from the tree when ripe, be consumed by other life forms as nourishment, and to propagate the seeds so that the apple may once again come forth from the tree. What do we do with apples, really? We pluck them a little early so that they are as unripe as possible, that they may last as long as possible as we transport them during the process of commodification and consumption. When we get them home, we consume them, which is the only natural part of the process. And when we're done with them, we throw away the seeds. These seeds are life. These seeds are the perpetuation of the tree that bears the fruit. Now, we cannot translate what we actually do with apples and the way we use that analogy into a solution for the problems we face as human beings, because that process would be severely counterproductive. We need to think beyond such limiting yet attractive lingo. A few bad apples will speed up the corruption and the rotting away of all the apples. The solution, healing, forgiveness, spiritual transformative work that renders an uplifting and an evolutionary growth, not just for any one given apple, but for the entire species. That is something we don't have a handy-dandy analogy for. That is something we do not have an axiom that fits right in with all the other axioms. Why is that? As I've suggested in previous episodes, the pattern that one finds in history seems to be that we have been conditioned, dare I say brainwashed, to ignore, marginalize, ridicule, and avoid investigating, outright reject the implementation of compassionate, loving, healing forgiveness as a means not to destroy the rotten apple before it causes more damage, but to heal the individual that is being hijacked by corruption. That, my friends, will go a lot further than any of the stereotypical responses we have to the problems that we face. We must acknowledge that there are more bad apples than we allow ourselves to see. We must acknowledge that all apples are on the very precipice of rotting away. We must understand that all human beings are a mix of light and dark, and that we cannot cut out the darkness. We cannot chop off the heads of those bad apples and then assume that all the other apples will remain pure and full and juicy and tasty ad nauseum for all time. We cannot chop out just the rotten bits from a human being. Because if all we do is carve out the one visibly ruined part, we ignore the fact that all the rest of that body is still in danger of corruption. If you take an apple that has a brown spot and carve a slice that contains that brown spot out, you know what you've really done? You've opened up the core of the apple and hastened the rotting process for the rest of that body. If we were to go around and kill the bad guys that we know, we just make room for the bad guys we have not identified to step up and fill that gap. Like I said in a recent episode, both World War I and World War II were massive efforts to chop all those rotten apples out. Did we end all wars? Have we freed ourselves from corruption? Did tyranny suddenly disappear? No. Look around you. Those wars achieved only the objectives of the war profiteers. We must, as individual members of this collective species, understand that we, as apples, are all in danger of that corruption. We, as life forms, all have within us the darkness that can grow and make manifest the quote-unquote evilness that we desire to fight so strongly. We will not end wars by fighting more wars. We will not stop corruption from spreading by destroying that which is already obviously corrupt. We must really step back and look at the situation with clarity and not allow the indoctrination of those that perpetuate the corruption we are trying to solve or get rid of from infiltrating us and filtering our perceptions. This is hard work. It is so much easier to yell at the rotten apple and tell it that it's rotten. But in doing so, we choose to ignore the growing corruption or potential for corruption within ourselves. The rotten apple thing goes hand in hand with a bit of supposed spiritual wisdom that I've long questioned and doubted, and that I'm now, after years of that struggle, mostly convinced is a mistake. We cannot kill our ego. I've said it before and I'll say it again because it needs to hit home. It needs to go viral. It needs to be understood, both by people already in the, quote, spiritual community or working really hard on their spiritual path, and all those who don't buy into spiritualism. Mind you, I hate isms, right? So spirituality should not turn into an ism. And axioms like, kill your ego, that's the slippery slope of going from a practice to an ideological dogma. No one knows what it means to kill your own ego. What do? Put a gun to your own head? I mean, the ego sits right inside our skull and whispers seductive, slippery slope arguments that lure us towards corruption. We cannot, should not, kill our own ego because it is a natural, born, organic part of us as we are. I've already gone off on that in some other episode. But I think the point is really worth repeating. What the ego wants is for us to be distracted by conflict. And an attempt to kill it, any attempt to kill the ego, our own or other people's, what is that? It's conflict. Healing the ego. Healing the rotten apple, if you can imagine it. Imagine looking at a bunch of apples and going, oh, look at that one. It's all gross and wrinkly and gooey. And instead of going, let's mush it and destroy it and throw it away, what if we could orchestrate or implement or manifest or work some kind of healing magic on that apple. What if we as individuals, we as collective communities, we as an entire collective species focused on that magic that heals as opposed to the violence that perpetuates violence? I think we would achieve much more. "5,000 years of history, and we have had revolution after revolution. We've killed bad guys here and bad guys there. We've made patriotic stands and fought for our countries. And what have we really achieved? The butchering of our fellow brothers and sisters in the human species. And the hoisting up of the next puppets of tyranny into positions of power. By smashing those rotten apples, we've spread the rot. We've splattered all the apples in the bunch with more corrosive corruption. Instead of bashing those apples, instead of thinking that destroying the bad guys will solve our problems, we must turn inward and do the hard work of healing our own little brown spots, of finding them, confronting them within ourselves, holding ourselves accountable, and then helping those around us do the same. We must lift each other up so that we can lift ourselves up, so that the whole species can transform. The next time you hear someone say, well, that problem is just a few bad apples, stop them in their tracks, please, and tell them to listen to this episode. Or use your own words to summarize this idea that I'm trying to share, probably not as eloquently as I could. The next time people talk about the bad apples, remind them that that is a distancing. That is an otherification of the problem. It's not me, it's the bad apples over there. The more we help identify this distancing, this passing the buck, the more we identify the flaws in the logic that we rely on in our society, the more progress we will make towards discovering within ourselves that which is divine, that which will heal, that which will transcend the corruption.
And that is what I've got to say about that. As always, thank you kindly for listening. This has been the Almost Daily Zencast, with your humble host, the incorrigible Mr. Zappa. Until next time, may peace, love, and grooviness blossom in your heart.